Hey everyone, it's Mystery Girl with Missy, and I'm Missy. I want to first start off by apologizing for the humming noise in the background. It's over 100 degrees today and it is really hot. There is no way I'd be able to do this without the fans and the air condition going, so I'm sorry. We're going to PilgrimState Psychiatric Hospital today, which is located in Brentwood, New York. My husband grew up in Brentwood, and the sights of the buildings were always extremely visible. He was actually able to see some of the top of the buildings from his elementary school. But PilgrimState is known for its treatment of its patients as well as its paranormal activity. I did try to reach out to some of my paranormal friends to see if anybody had been there and had video that they would like to share, but unfortunately the restrictions and the laws there about going, people could get arrested. So unfortunately I didn't get any video footage on that. Pilgrim Psychiatric Center was formerly known as PilgrimState Hospital and is a state-run psychiatric hospital located in Brentwood, New York. PilgrimState Psychiatric Hospital started as a farm colony that was built to alleviate the overcrowding of other Long Island, New York mental hospitals. It was named after Dr. Charles W. Pilgrim, who served as the Commissioner of Mental Health in the 20th century and is located at 998 Crooked Hill Road in Brentwood, New York. Charles W. Pilgrim, through the state, purchased 1,000 acres of land in Brentwood. It wasn't long before it was overwhelmed by the number of patients. The hospital buildings were on 825 acres of property in Brentwood, New York, expanding to 1,000 acres to build Edgewood. The construction started in late 1928 and early 1929 and opened October 1st, 1931. With 100 patients that were transferred in from Central Islip State Hospital. 9 months later, the population had grown to over 2,018, with more patients being transferred in. In 1954, PilgrimState was the largest mental hospital in the United States, with 13,875 patients, then over 15,000 patients in less than 25 years of its opening. Its size has never been exceeded by any other facility, making it at the time the largest in the world. PilgrimState was built for 12,500 patients, and it had 4,000 employees by 1954. Each set of the buildings were known as quads. Now there's well over 100 buildings. But in these quads, it was a set of 4 buildings that were situated around a center building. Now that mid-center building was where the reception area was, patient intake, and the center building is also where most of the buildings had its kitchen area and dining area for both patients and staff. PilgrimState was initially built to relieve overcrowding of the Kings Park and Central Islip Psychiatric Center. Kings Park Psychiatric Hospital was a 150-building asylum, and it was built in 1885. By 1954, it had a population of 10,000 patients. And like I said, they started transferring some of their patients to PilgrimState because of the overpopulation at Kings Park. By the 1970s, most of the patients were transferred to nursing homes or to PilgrimState, or they were actually just released. Now, my husband, one of his first jobs, there was, I guess, a corner from what he was telling me where the bus would let off actual patients from PilgrimState and Kings Park. And he told me that some of these patients were just so lost, I guess they wouldn't take their medication, or they would just left there, and they would go into the stores looking for food, just roam the streets. Unfortunately, some of them were actually killed because they weren't there mentally, and people, I don't know if they were afraid or what, but unfortunately some of these people were actually killed in the Brentwood area because they were released and they were not ready to be released into society. Central Islip Psychiatric Center, which was built in 1887, had 100 buildings and 2,500 employees, making it the second largest psychiatric hospital in the nation after PilgrimState. Both Kings Park and Central Islip were originally experiments of farm colonies to benefit patients with outdoor activities and work. By the 1960s, both Kings Park and Central Islip started deinstitutionalizing, replacing care with community-based mental health services, and by 1996, transferred remaining patients to PilgrimState. PilgrimState also had the underground tunnels that connected the various buildings, which is where they would sometimes transfer patients as well as materials. Like I said, PilgrimState Psychiatric Center is a massive amount of acreage with buildings on it, and this here is from 1931, and it's a list of all of the buildings. It's kind of hard to read, so I did type them out. Building numbers 1, 2, 4, 27, 28, 30, and 31 were buildings that were used for continued treatment centers for men. So that's 7 buildings that were just for men. Number 5 was a geriatrics building, also for men. Numbers 6, 7, 9, 11, 12, 14, and 15 are 7 buildings that were just for women for continued treatment. Building number 10 is for readmission intensive treatment for women. Men and women were separated, they were not together. Building numbers 3, 8, 13, 21, 41, and at the time 83 were kitchen and dining areas for these centers. Those were the center buildings. If you remember, I told you the center building of each building is where the kitchen was situated. Building number 16 was the water tower for PilgrimState. Like I said, it had its own little city there. Number 17 was a greenhouse. Number 18 was the administration building. Number 19 was married employees. It was homes for them to live. Number 20 was administration addition, and number 22 was men's reception. Within the area, they had everything they needed. They never had to leave the 1,000 acres that these buildings were on. Whatever they needed was right there at their fingertips. They had garages as well that stored a lot of the supplies that they needed. Building number 23, the Central Medical Building, medical and surgical buildings. This is where the lobotomies were done. This is where the surgical lobotomies were done. Number 24 was women's reception. Building number 25 was geriatrics admission and intensive treatment. This building is still open to this day. It's still in use. Number 26 was the assembly hall. Number 32 was the railroad station, which was used on Sundays to bring in family visitors for the patients. They had everything right down to a railroad station, which blows my mind. I mean, growing up in Long Island, I didn't know all of this. It's crazy to me. Building number 33 was a utility storage. Number 34 was a storehouse. Number 35 was the powerhouse. They had their own electric building that supplied electric for the whole entire area. Number 36 was the bakery and maintenance shops. Number 37 was laundry, and number 38 was an industrial building. Number 39 was the firehouse and garage. They had their own fire department. Number 40 was truck storage. Number 81 and 82 was geriatric and diabetic intensive treatment until during World War II the government took over these buildings. These buildings are still in use and once used for the World War II soldiers. To read the full diagram, just pause the video, take a look at it. It's so interesting to see exactly what they had. Like I said, I didn't write everything out, but I wrote out the most important things. It blows my mind away that this little town inside of the town of Brentwood existed as its own little city. In addition to the buildings, they also have a church and a bank. They had tunnels, which was used for routing the utilities, and later they actually transferred patients from building to building underground, which is absolutely crazy to me. They have their own cemetery. Most of the stones are now covered with grass. Most have no names, only numbers. And unfortunately, most of the deaths were caused from the lobotomies. They now have a museum which offers a collection of memorabilia, artifacts, and photos representing the history of PilgrimState, Kings Park, Central Islip, and Edgewood. On November 5th, 2020, it flooded and destroyed most of the museum, and it's currently being restored. The museum does include equipment that was used for electric shock therapy and is surprisingly silent on the topic of the lobotomies. On top of everything that's on that list, PilgrimState had its own courts. It had its own post office with its own newspaper, its own athletic field, which the soldiers did use to play baseball during World War II. It has houses for its staff and its administration, greenhouses, its own morgue, and its own crematorium. 2 different sets of railroad tracks, which are part of the Long Island Railroad, and a cemetery which sits on 10 acres of land behind the brick water tower. In the late 1930s, PilgrimState averaged 1 death a day. PilgrimState's reputation was always horrible on the way that it treated its patients. Mental illness wasn't known very well on how to treat it back in the 1930s. And although they thought they were doing the right thing with the lobotomies and the electric shock, which electric shock therapy is still used to this day, just not to the extreme, sometimes they use those treatments as punishment, and that's just absolutely horrible. The stories that people have spoken about it will make your blood curl. I'm in the medical field, and I work with patients with Alzheimer's and dementia and children that are medically frail, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, nonverbal, G-tube, J-tube, paraplegic, and autism. I can't imagine, because children were also treated here. I can't imagine one of the residents that I have worked with being treated to the extent that some of these patients have been treated. I would not be able to sit back as a human being that has a love for the medical field and watch patients and residents be treated the way that many of these patients were treated. I know that, the lobotomies and the, electric shock therapy was what they knew at the time. And for the most part, they were trying to help. But to know that these treatments were used as punishment on some patients, just honestly, it hurts me to the core. PilgrimState was always known as a terrifying place. And I remember as a child, I was maybe 5, 6 years old. We went to go and visit my uncle who lived in Northport. And on the way home, my aunt was driving, and she was from Pennsylvania, so she made the wrong turn and turned into PilgrimState. And oh my goodness, the fear that came over everybody in that car. I remember my mom saying, lock the doors, lock the doors. It was just terrifying. This was the late 70s, early 80s maybe. It was terrifying. We couldn't get out of there fast enough. Just driving through there, the eeriness was, I can't even explain it. And, then again, when I was maybe 10 or 12 years old, when the buildings were, vacant and, empty, the Knights of Columbus had a carnival there. And I remember my parents took us, and we were having a great time, having fun. It was on the grounds. It wasn't like at the buildings, but you could see the buildings. And we kept hearing somebody screaming, "Help me, somebody help me." And when we looked up at the buildings, there was somebody at the very top with their hands around the bars on the windows, and they were just screaming, "Help me." I had nightmares for years about that. It was kids that went into the building and were having a fun time. But for somebody that's 10 or 11 years old, it was pretty traumatizing. My husband, when he was growing up, when they were teenagers, they used to go onto the side street over there and they would have parties, just hanging out in the street. But a lot of kids go into these buildings and they're vandalizing them and, knocking them down, graffiti on the walls. A lot of the paranormal community goes in there because it's known for its paranormal activity. But they're not there to harm the buildings. They're there to investigate. But PilgrimState has such a history behind it. PilgrimState continued to grow as the patient population increased greatly. Eventually, the state of New York bought up more land to the southwest to the facility to construct Edgewood State Hospital, a short-lived facility that was a subsidiary of Pilgrim State Hospital. In fact, Pilgrim State Hospital was so large that it reached into 4 Suffolk towns, Huntington, Babylon, Smithtown, and Islip, and had 2 state roads passing through its grounds. Treatments at Pilgrim included many types of shock therapy, methods that were risky, but the only kind of relief that science could offer at the time before Thorazine was developed in the 1950s. Patients at PilgrimState were admitted for mental illness of one extreme to another. Some suffered from psychotic episodes, psychosis. Others had mental illnesses which are now known as anxiety and depression, but back in the 1930s weren't really known to be an illness that was so easily managed with medication. They had these patients that were able to function more freely, work on the farm. And the farm patient treatment was putting patients to work on the PilgrimState farm colony to give them a job and a purpose. This was for the less severe mental illness patients. When this didn't work, for some of the patients, electric shock and lobotomy were used. Other treatments that were used were straitjackets, insulin shock comas, metrazole shock therapy. In 1958, Dr. Henry Brill became the director at the hospital and became an advocate for the use of antipsychotics and tranquilizers. Prior to this, Dr. Brill was part of 350 prefrontal lobotomies in the late 1940s. Patients were not treated with love or kindness for the most part at PilgrimState. They were dragged around, they were put in straitjackets. If someone was out of control, they would fill a tub with ice and put the patient in it to calm them down. Patients were routinely tortured and beaten. But it wasn't all bad. They did have activities for patients like our current nursing homes do, where they would have dances and socialize with each other, play games. They even had the baseball field. But for the most part, PilgrimState reputation of its treatment of patients was horrible. Building 23 on the top floor is where prefrontal lobotomies took place, an irreversible operation. Lobotomies were performed starting in 1946. By 1959, 2,000 lobotomies had been performed. Lobotomy is one of the most controversial surgical procedures in medical history. It's said to follow many patients to the grave, a crude brain surgery from its initial use. The lobotomy was an attempt to control violent mental patients by inserting leukoderma into the brain, penetrating it through one opening in the skull to the other, and then inserting a probe into the brain and blindly moving it about, severing nerve connections in the frontal lobe of the brain to the area that controls behavior, intelligence, and personality. Lobotomy is a form of neurological treatment for psychotic disorders or neurological disorders, including epilepsy, that involves severing connections in the brain, prefrontal cortex. The surgery causes most of the connections to and from the prefrontal cortex, the anterior part of the frontal lobes of the brain, to be severed. To this day, lobotomy is the second most common surgery for epilepsy and usually done on one side of the brain, unlike lobotomies for psychotic disorders, which were done on both sides of the brain. More lobotomies were performed on women than men. A 1951 study, 60% of American lobotomies were women. The purpose was to reduce the symptoms of mental disorders, and it was recognized that this was done at the expense of a person's personality and intellect. Following the operation, spontaneity, responsiveness, self-awareness, and self-control were reduced. People were mostly left emotionally blunt and restricted in their intellectual range. Some patients died as a result of the operation, and others later took their own lives. Walter Freeman, physician, neurologist, known for popularizing lobotomy, coined the term surgically induced childhood and used it constantly to refer to the results of lobotomy. This procedure was used to treat severely disturbed and uncontrolled patients whom they felt were a threat to themselves and others. Patients diagnosed as extreme paranoid, schizophrenics, people who heard voices, got upset for no reason. Sadly, this procedure was also known to be used on patients at PilgrimState with Down syndrome, causing irreparable damage to the patient. A lobotomy at PilgrimState would take approximately 45 minutes. The drill used was an actual hand drill to drill the holes into the skull. Then probes would be used. There was no antipsychotic drugs at the time, and lobotomy was thought to be a miracle cure. Some doctors state it was a mistake, but it was what was available at the time. Antipsychotic drug discovery in the late 1950s ended the lobotomy era. For some patients, this resulted in death. In others, they never functioned the same way, resulting in acting like children, some basically brain dead. In the 1970s, when medications became known for mental illness, positive results were stabilizing patients, some even going back home to family and living normal lives. Unfortunately, that can't be said for lobotomy patients of PilgrimState. Roughly 1 out of 25 lobotomy patients occurred at PilgrimState Psychiatric Center. Doctors now say it's possible some lobotomies led to schizophrenia rather than curing it. There are still currently hundreds of people that continue to suffer the consequences of this treatment. I've seen videos of patients that had lobotomy that had no issues. They were just maybe having a depression or anxiety episodes and had a lobotomy done and now cannot speak. What they did to some of these patients is not acceptable at all.
Among the small, anonymous gravestones covered with grass lie many of the lobotomy patients, their final resting place marked only by a number. Lobotomy, an irreversible operation that followed them to the grave, a mysterious word that conjures up images of crude brain surgery. But exactly what is lobotomy? Why did it happen? To whom was it done?
In the following procedure, the surgeon inserts the leucotome into the brain.
Lobotomy was one of the most controversial surgical procedures in medical history.
His first move is to penetrate directly through the brain from one opening in the skull to the other.
This is historic footage from the National Library of Medicine of an actual lobotomy operation being performed in 1942.
The surgeon then clamps a hemostat.
Lobotomy was an attempt to control violent mental patients by inserting a probe into the brain and blindly moving it about, severing nerve connections in the frontal lobe of the brain, the main area that controls behavior, intelligence, and personality. It was done because, at the time, almost nothing else was available to treat severely disturbed and uncontrollable people who were a physical threat to themselves and others. Patients diagnosed as extreme paranoid schizophrenics.
Tom, this was our operating room. The patients would be lined in the hall. The prep had already been done. Their heads were shaven, ready for the lobotomies. And they were brought into this room.
And roughly how long did it take to do a lobotomy?
45 minutes. The surgeon would be over here. The patient would be here.
The head of the table?
At the head of the table. The drill itself was a hand drill.
A hand drill?
A hand drill. And the surgeon would drill. We would be handling the instruments. All right. Then they would use a probe. And they would go into the...
Through the holes in the skull.
That's exactly right.
This was as routine as what, a tonsillectomy?
Exactly. In mental institutions it was.
During World War II, buildings 81, 82, and 83 were commandeered by the War Department. Building 82 is a 9-story building and stands about 109 feet tall. This was one of the buildings that was commandeered and is still used to this day. Soldiers that were fighting in World War II that were either exhausted or needed a break were sent to PilgrimState for time to rest and recuperate. Others were sent there thinking that they had mental issues, which we now know as PTSD. Unfortunately, some of our soldiers were subject to lobotomies and shock therapy. It's sad that our war heroes were treated this way because at the time they didn't know what PTSD was. Most soldiers were staying at Edgewood while others did stay at buildings 81, 82, and 83. It's sad that our soldiers had to undergo treatments that were unnecessary. Meanwhile, they were fighting for our country. Not all soldiers suffered the cruel treatment at PilgrimState. Some were actually able to recuperate and rest and take advantage of the baseball field and enjoy some of what was offered at PilgrimState. But to this day, Edgewood and Building 81, 82, and 83 will be known for being commandeered by the War Department. Hydrotherapy, also known as tub therapy, is where some patients actually spend days in a tub. Dr. Charles Pilgrim took water treatments to an extreme with what he called tub therapy, introducing it in a form of a continuous bath. Patients entered the tub and reclined on a canvas hammock in warm water with a rubber pillow behind their necks. Water temperatures were monitored by nurses. Most patients would have enjoyed this for an hour or two, but Dr. Charles Pilgrim's treatment was much longer. Patients and residents would sleep for 6 hours in the tub, have breakfast in the tub, dinner in the tub. Occasionally, the doctor would come in to talk or take blood. He felt the patients grew calmer, more rested, and more cheerful After several days, the patient would get out of the tub with help from a nurse as they were too weak to walk. The treatment was for patients who felt madness coming on or fear of a breakdown. This treatment could be voluntary for some patients, but other patients had no choice. Another was insulin shock therapy, which entails injecting a patient with a large dose of insulin in order to induce seizures and/or coma. PilgrimState started using this in 1936. Some patients were as young as the age of 19, some being placed into as many as 44 insulin comas. How insane is that? If this contributed to be unsuccessful, the patient typically underwent a lobotomy. Dr. Brill learned of this when he visited Dr. Manfred Seikel in Vienna and brought his learnings back to PilgrimState. He should have left those learnings right in Vienna. These treatments would cause some patients to have a memory span of 30 seconds as a result for some patients for the rest of their lives. Another injection that they would use is cortisol. They would inject residents or patients with cortisol to get the same effect as what they were doing with the insulin. And the same thing, if that didn't work, then it was usually the next option of lobotomy or electric shock therapy. Another one was the ice tub treatment, which was putting the residents into a tub that was full of ice to calm them down. If that didn't work, then they would use the tub therapy, which was what I just explained, leaving a patient in a tub for almost a week, which I don't understand. How do you do that? I mean, now the patient is, your skin can literally fall off, number one, but you have to urine and you have to have feces. So you're sitting in your own filth as what they consider treatment. I can't fathom or understand some of the thinkings that went on at PilgrimState. I understand that a lot of the treatments weren't available, but common sense does exist. I don't know. Electric shock therapy was another one that was popular. It was a very popular method at PilgrimState for schizophrenia and mental illness. It passed a current of electricity through a patient's brain in order to induce a grand mal seizure. By 1953, approximately 300 patients at any given moment were being subject to electric shock therapy. Doctors advocated for electric shock therapy into the 1970s, but it died down by the end of the 20th century. But it did continue into the 21st century. PilgrimState has even come under investigation for reportedly forcing electric shock therapy onto its patients. It's so upsetting to think that instead of doctors and nurses dealing with a patient's mental state of mind, sometimes just a simple conversation, which I learned with patients with Alzheimer's and dementia, just a simple conversation of sitting down and spending time and talking and just distracting the person's mind can slowly change the state that they're in. I get that there's mental illness that's not the same as Alzheimer's and dementia and can't be compared in any way, but there's other ways to consider to try to go about calming a patient or a resident down instead of using harsh treatments such as electric shock therapy, insulin injections, cortisol injections. ice cubes, soaking in tubs, and lobotomies. I just don't understand how those were their go-to. I know times were different. I know medical wasn't as informed and educated and everything as it is today, but compassion has to exist in people. When you get into the medical field, you can't get into it for the wrong reason. You need to get into it and have compassion for who you're assisting and who you're treating and just who you're spending time with. Compassion can go a lot further than a lot of people think. Like I said, PilgrimState Psychiatric Hospital was its own little city within Brentwood. It had its own morgue. The morgue had, obviously, the freezers, but they also did their own autopsies here. The autopsies were actually on a section of this area that was on the opposite side of the freezers. This is the autopsy room now as it stands in the abandoned building, but it's actually right on the opposite side of the morgue. So they did their own autopsies, and they also did their own cremations. PilgrimState left nothing to the outside, which makes you question just how much isn't known. These are pictures of what it looks like now after the buildings have been abandoned for years and still obviously stand, but people going into them out of curiosity or for paranormal, or just some kids going in there to cause destruction. But they had their own morgue, they did their own autopsies, and they had their own cemetery, which is behind the water tower. You could see in the cemetery, the stones, a lot of them don't have names. Most of them don't have names. They're just identified as a number, which makes you question, do these families even know what happened to their loved one when they were there? You know, were they just put there and left there? Were they people that had no family at all and ended up here? It's very sad to think of the way that these people lived before they died, and then when they were put into the cemetery at PilgrimState, their name wasn't even put on the little bit of stone, which is now mostly covered by grass and weeds. It's heartbreaking. When PilgrimState was built, they were built to have underground tunnels which went from building to building to building. This way they can transfer materials or medical necessities. But over the years, these tunnels actually became a way of transporting patients from one building to another. Through the grounds on the outside, you can still see where there's a stone that you can lift, and when you lift that stone, straight underneath is a metal ladder that goes into these tunnels and comes out into all the different buildings. The Long Island Railroad, unbelievable to me that PilgrimState actually had 2 tracks that went through their 1,000 acres that had a stop right at their facility. The train tracks were used so they could bring patients' family members in from Nassau County, Queens, Manhattan, into Suffolk County, Brentwood, where the patients were at PilgrimState. Now, they would run these trains once a week on Sundays, and this was a way for the residents and the patients there to be able to see their family members. It's so amazing to me to look at these pictures and see how old the trains were. Yeah, I remember the older trains from when we used to have to pick up my father at the train station when he worked at the garment industry in Manhattan. But to see some of these old pictures is pretty wild. But again, they had their own train station in PilgrimState. Like, there is nothing that I can think of in my head that this 1,000 acres of property did not have. It's mind-blowing how big it was to begin with, but to know what was actually on that property. So PilgrimState did have the 2 tracks for the train station. One was for coal, so it could be delivered to the powerhouse, and the other was to bring in family members of the patients and residents. The PilgrimState had these 2 smoke towers that you could see, oh, there it is, from miles away. They stood really tall. But this is now abandoned, and you can see the one train track that goes to the smoke towers and the other that goes straight ahead, which would be the station, I guess, where they dropped off the family members so they could visit with their family. This is from 1978, and it's a schedule change from the Ronkonkoma branch of PilgrimState. It says the Sunday-only train between Jamaica and PilgrimState Hospital and return will make its last trip on Sunday, May 21st. This train is being discontinued because of lack of patronage, which is either a sad thing because family members weren't going to see their family, or just less patients were there from Nassau and Manhattan. This is a picture of the last eastbound train that actually went to PilgrimState Psychiatric Hospital in 1978. It was train number 276, and it was the very last passenger train that went through. These here are also abandoned tracks that are still there. If you go there and you're walking around, you can actually see some of the tracks. Some of them, again, have been destroyed by vandals, but a lot of them are mostly covered by grass. So a lot of the history is still there. Sometimes you just got to dig a little bit for it. The grass stands a lot taller than what is shown in this picture here, and a lot of the tracks have literally been either thrown into the woods or, you know, just people just taking them as memorabilia. So you can see here where it goes through the wooded area, and there's actually trees and stuff now growing above it, but a lot of the track is missing, and you know, nature has grown around it. Edgewood was part of the commandeered area from World War II, along with buildings 81, 82, and 83. Edgewood was so big that it could be seen from all over Long Island. It was built in 1942, and it was knocked down August 16th of 1989. It was property of the War Department with 700 to 900 beds during World War II. It was commandeered by the War Department, and it served as a TB unit when it returned to the state. It served as a place for soldiers with PTSD in addition to the buildings 81, 82, and 83 at PilgrimState. Building 102 was the main building serving soldiers. In 1946, a documentary was made by John Huston called Let There Be Light, and it was highly controversial and could not be seen by the public until 1981. The building was known as Mason General Hospital during the war and later transferred back to the state and called Edgewood Hospital after the war. It was at one time the biggest building on Long Island, which was taken over by the size of Kings Park Building 93. My husband could see the rooftops of the buildings from Loretta Park Elementary School on the other side of Brentwood, the southeast side of Brentwood. The building was shut down in 1971. It only lasted 29 years before it was shut down from 1971 to 1989, and it was left abandoned and open to vandalism, sadly. The grounds are where I told you I had gone to that carnival by the Knights of Columbus. That's exactly where the carnival was, is right here. The town of Brentwood is known for its gang activity, MS-13 being its primary gang. In 2016, there were a rash amount of murders that were occurring, and a lot of the bodies were actually found on the grounds of the abandoned areas of PilgrimState. Multiple bodies have been found on the abandoned grounds of Pilgrim Psychiatric Hospital, resulting from MS-13 gang murders. This got to the extent where President Trump came to Brentwood to try to lower the amount of gang members, which resulted in hundreds of arrests.
The second time police in Suffolk County uncover human remains.
Last Friday, skeletal remains were found in a different location in Brentwood. TV 1055's Tracy Carrasco is live on the scene with more for us. Tracy?
Dick and Alice, disturbing discoveries in Brentwood tonight. A second set of human remains found in this wooded area behind me as police identified a set of human remains found on Friday as a missing 19-year-old man. That missing man identified as Oscar Acosta, a high school senior last seen near his Brentwood home on April 29th. Detectives had suspected foul play in his disappearance. The second set of human remains found today close to Acosta's have not been identified and are being examined by the medical examiner. Both sets of remains were found in this wooded area off MJ Boulevard in an industrial part of town. Investigators have been out here all day and say there is a violent known gang member in custody, but wouldn't identify the person or say if they were connected to this case.
We're going to do everything in our power to get to the bottom of the missing person investigation of Mr. Acosta. And we're going to do everything in our power to decimate gangs in the Brentwood community. We'll make sure that we're doing everything in our power to ensure the safety of the residents of Brentwood.
Now, police did not say if the remains were connected to the deaths of two teenage best friends, Misa Mickens and Kayla Cuevas, whose badly beaten bodies were found in Brentwood last week, killed by suspected gang violence. There have been no arrests in that case. In the last week, community leaders have acknowledged the growing gang problem here in Brentwood. Again, no word yet if all of these cases are connected. We're live tonight in Brentwood. Tracy Carrasco, TV 1055.
All right.
Will announce the formation of a gang unit today. It will focus exclusively on prosecuting crimes committed by gangs, including MS-13. Yesterday, President Trump held a White House roundtable discussion on MS-13. Police say members of that gang, most from El Salvador, have killed 17 people on Long Island in the past year and a half. The president called for another government shutdown if Democrats don't support tougher immigration laws.
If we don't change it, let's have a shutdown. We'll do a shutdown, and it's worth it for our country. I'd love to see a shutdown if we don't get this stuff taken care of.
The president says MS-13 is growing in the U.S. because of what he called the stupidity of our immigration laws.
To this day, a lot of the buildings are still open, Building 25 being one of them. There are still patients that get admitted for mental illness, and during research, it looks like some of the buildings that are open are used as just regular medical facilities. PilgrimState has had a very bad reputation, and it seems in newer research that that's been turned around. Patients that are there and being treated the way that they should be now. The grounds with the abandoned buildings, the property has been purchased, but every option that somebody comes up with to build something there gets turned down by either the residents of Brentwood because they wanted to build apartment complexes or stores or, just build on it, and also because the area that comes from PilgrimState is so full of asbestos that they'd have to build high-rise buildings. Building 81, 82, and 83 are still there and still functioning to this day. During the research, it looks like Building 82 is actually used as an urgent care. I can't confirm it, but it is what it looked like and what I read during my research. Here is the information that shows that it's still open. It's actually open 24 hours. These buildings that are still there still have the kitchen facilities and, medical facilities, obviously. But PilgrimState is one of the few last standing active buildings that are still available to patients with mental illness on Long Island, serving Nassau and Suffolk County. One of the things I did do during my research was look up the reviews about PilgrimState. Even though most of it is shut down, some of the buildings, 82, 102, and Phoenix House, are still open. The reviews about the area, I have to share some of them with you. One says, "It's spooky, crackheads litter the place at night. In the day, you can meet fellow photographers, people still driving through." Another wrote, "Just tell the doctors what they want to hear and they let you go." Another wrote, "It's not so bad there. I have visited numerous times for meetings for my career. Yes, you do hear screaming, but it's from a locked ward." That is a big thing about PilgrimState. The screams. People always spoke about hearing people scream, and that's just terrifying to even think about. Another wrote, "Straitjackets don't chafe as much as other nut houses." Another wrote, "Spooky, scary skeletons." Another wrote, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." Obviously, somebody trying to be funny. Another wrote, "You can still hear the screams from the past." Another wrote, "The snoozeberries taste like snoozeberries." Okay. Another wrote, "Never judge a book by its cover." Another wrote, "Not the happiest place to be." Another said, "It's not as bad here as people make it seem." Another wrote, "It's not haunted, so just leave." Another wrote, "Try the meatloaf." People talk about the paranormal activity over at PilgrimState. And I did, like I said, I did try to find somebody that would be willing to go and maybe do an EVP session. Unfortunately, because the security is so high there, people can get very highly fined. So I wasn't able to get that. But I did watch a lot of videos of people that have gone to PilgrimState and done EVP sessions, or have, gone through and heard voices. A lot of them on the EVPs, it's, it comes up, get out, leave. There's a lot of cursing. Some hear things drop or tables move. So if you do want to find out about the paranormal activity at PilgrimState, I do recommend watching some of those videos on YouTube. I just was not able to provide that for you, and I do apologize. Do I believe that PilgrimState is haunted? I do. I think there's too much history and torture and death surrounding the area for there not to be. But my husband, on the other hand, told me if I believe that, then he wants to sell me a bridge. So everybody believes something different. But in conclusion, in the 1970s, when medicine began to treat mental illness, many patients were able to go back to living normal lives, being discharged, and being able to function in society. This resulted in a great amount of patients being discharged in the 1970s and 80s, leaving most buildings shut down now. The buildings are still there. Some still function for patients. Most of the buildings are abandoned and in disrepair, and much of the land was sold. As of today, PilgrimState provides inpatient and outpatient psychiatric patient care, including Central Nassau Guidance Center and Transitional Services, an addiction treatment center named Charles K. Post, Phoenix House, a residential treatment center for substance abuse, and 4 outpatient treatment centers, and 1 ACT team. PilgrimState still does have inpatient services, rapid recovery with symptom reduction, programs that develop skills to manage psychiatric illness. So, like I said, they've changed their standard of care. Now, instead of punishing patients for having a mental illness, they're teaching them how to deal with their illnesses. There are currently 11 inpatient units, including 3 admission units, 2 geriatric units, and 6 psychiatric rehabilitation units. The Discharge Academy offers an opportunity to practice daily living skills before being discharged, where they used to drop the patients by bus just into the road and let them figure it out for themselves. Now they're actually training and teaching daily living skills. They offer a swimming pool, a bowling alley, a gym, game room, and a model apartment with a kitchen to teach patients how to live independently, owning an apartment, keeping it and maintaining it, and learning how to cook. They have computer training, library, and outdoor courtyard with a garden. Buildings 81 through 83 were briefly used as a correctional facility in the 1980s, but after community protests were done, renovating and used for psychiatric use. In 1996, the remaining patients from Kings Park and Central Islip Psychiatric Center were transferred to PilgrimState when they closed. A 52-acre portion of PilgrimState has become the Brentwood State Park Athletic Field complex, while the rest sits unused. In 1972, half of PilgrimState property farm became the Suffolk County Community College Grant Campus that opened in 1974, using the buildings and houses as halls and security offices for the college. The former post office and vegetable garden became Pumanak Hall in 1995. In the 1980s, parts of PilgrimState were used as the correctional facility. In 1982, it held 596 imprisoned people to relieve overcrowding from the jails in Nassau and Suffolk County and Queens. In 1983, they remodeled to hold them up to 1,000 remaining to hold up to 1,000 remaining patients, and remained open until 1985. By 1999, the old barns and other buildings became more education centers and classrooms. By 2003, most of Pilgrim's Psychiatric Center was demolished and left in rubbles of bricks on the grounds where the buildings were, and they were never cleaned up. Building numbers 81, 82, and 83, as well as Edgewood Building 102, which was once used for soldiers during World War II. The movie that was once banned is now available on YouTube, and it's called Let There Be Light. 1946 is when it was made. This is a movie I have actually wanted to watch since I found out about it, and I fully intend to watch this. It does actually feature PilgrimState Psychiatric Center, so I'm probably actually going to end up watching it right after the premiere of this video. Which, again, guys, I want to thank you all for being here and for your support, and just remember, hit that like and the thumbs up. I really appreciate your support. The movie Let There Be Light was a 1946 film. Let There Be Light 1946, known to the U.S. Army as PMF 5019, is a documentary film that was directed by American filmmaker John Huston, who lived from 1906 to 1987. It was the last in a series of 4 films. It was directed by Huston while serving in the U.S. Army Signal Corps during World War II. The film was intended to educate the public about post-traumatic stress disorder and its treatment among returning veterans, but its unscripted presentation of mental disability caused the U.S. government to suppress the film, and it was not released until the 1980s. Demobilizing near the end of World War II, the U.S. Army had the task of returning military veterans into peaceful society. Many veterans faced the stigma associated with shell shock or psychosis. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. The former term for post-traumatic stress disorder. To convince the public, and especially employers, that veterans being treated for battle-induced mental instability were completely normal after psychiatric treatment. On June 25, 1945, the Army Signal Corps tasked Major John Huston with producing the documentary, The Returning Psychoneurotics. Huston visited multiple Army hospitals on the East and West Coast before deciding upon Mason General Hospital in Deer Park, New York on Long Island, which is also known as Edgewood. The reason for the selections were that Mason General was the largest mental health facility on the East Coast, that the hospital was located near the Army's Motion Picture Production Center at Astoria Studios in Queens, and that the doctors were very open and receptive to the filming and any psychiatric questions that Huston had. The new title that Huston gave the film, Let There Be Light, was a reference to Genesis 1.3 of King James Version of the Bible, and alluded to the documentary's goal of revealing truths that were previously concealed as too frightening or shameful for knowledge. I definitely recommend watching this. Guys, thank you for watching, and remember, every day is a mystery. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button.